is actually on the Austin College Sneed property. But anyways, my background is in plant insect interactions. Not technically, my expertise is not in bees. And so if you want to talk to someone who's more versed in bees, I can point you in the right direction. But I have been studying plant insect interactions for over 10 years. And I got my start studying ant plant interactions. And then in graduate school, I started studying actually cotton entomology. And so I spent my grad school years in cotton fields. And then when I got started at Austin College, I got more focused on prairie ecology. And besides ants, my other area of expertise is the true bugs, so the hemipterans. But I often teach about bees just because of its high interest in high economic value. And so I do a little bit of beekeeping, like honeybees, but not too much. We have a couple of hives on the Sneed Austin College property, and so I take students out there every now and then. But then also I try to stay up to date on what we know about native bees. So that's what I'm here to talk to you all about. If anybody ever has a question, I'm welcome to field it. You can there's a raise hand function in the participants tab, but also I can try to keep an eye on the chat, and maybe Alan can help me do that too. But anyways, good morning. I hope everyone learned something new today. I do want to give credit for this beautiful photo on my front slide. There's a really famous macro photographer at UT Austin named Alex Wild. And his real claim to fame is photographing ants, but he does photograph other insects. And you can tell from the picture, he does a pretty good job. So I've sourced a bunch of my pictures from him in other places. I'm not really a photographer, and so I don't really take credit for any of the pictures here. If I can take credit, I'll let you know, but most of these I can't take credit. All right, so let's get this party started. All right, so native bees. I wanted to, let's see, first just kind of orient everyone to like, what is a bee? And if we're thinking about insect evolution, essentially bees are pollen-eating wasps. And so if anybody's a master naturalist or you studied entomology to a little degree, you may know that the bees, wasps, and ants are all in the same insect order, and it's called the Hymenoptera. And over evolutionary time, the wasps would have evolved first, followed by the ants, which are essentially ground-dwelling wasps, and then followed by the bees, which are pollen-eating wasps. And the diversification and evolution of the bees would have been closely linked to the evolution and diversification of flowering plants, so the angiosperms. But anyways, the bees are thought to have evolved once new niches or environmental habitats and food began to be available. And so they switched from a carnivorous diet, which would be what a wasp would normally eat, other insect prey, to a more plant-based diet like pollen and nectar. And so because of this plant-based diet, we do have a really good understanding that our bees are our most important pollinators. There are definitely other pollinators that don't get enough attention as they probably deserve, in my opinion. But the thing about bees is that they are really one of the groups that has the most behaviors to purposely collect pollen. Other pollinator groups like butterflies and flies tend to be like happenstance pollinators. And so just by visiting flowers, they pick up pollen grains and can move them. But a lot of bees are purposely collecting pollen because they use it as food for their larvae. So our bees do have complete metamorphosis similar to butterflies. And so they'll have a larval stage and a pupal stage. And the adult bees are collecting pollen and nectar to feed the larvae, which are mostly helpless. And so this behavioral stuff is what makes them really great pollinators. The other thing that can make them a really great pollinator, and I'm actually going to switch to a little laser pointer thing here on my screen, but is the distinguishing feature of bees versus like wasps is actually going to be these branched hairs. And so if you look at them under a microscope, they look like little miniature trees. Wasps can be hairy as well, but their hairs are going to be more bristle-like and smooth. And so it's really this branched hairs that make bees really effective at collecting pollens. Depending on the type of bee, there may be locations on their body where they have longer or shorter hairs. And then if you're a honeybee, you actually have hairs between your eye cells as well. So if you see a bee with hairy eyes, it's likely it's going to be a honeybee. But we're not really here to talk about honeybees. I'm going to touch on them a little bit. We do know just in general that bees of all kinds have high agricultural value, in particular for our fruits and vegetables, which need pollination services to make fruit. One in particular that is used, that honeybees are really important for is the almond agriculture. And so lots of honeybees are managed and maintained actually to support the almond agriculture in California. But these other fruits and vegetables, which we'll come to learn more about, really need other types of bees and not honeybees. But addition into the agriculture, so like the bees are definitely a foundational group for maintaining ecosystems. Okay, so there's all kinds of animals that rely on fruits as a food source, including birds and other mammals. But then, of course, there's things that eat fruits. Okay, so plants tend to be the base of our food webs, and the reproduction of plants is typically highly linked to whether or not they can get pollinated. So bees are an important part of the ecosystem in general, whether or not humans are involved. Now, I'm going to talk about honeybees just very briefly, and if anybody has any other honeybee questions, I can try to answer them now or later. But my main focus today is actually going to be native bees. And so one kind of trivia question to get out of the way is like the European honeybee or the managed honeybee that we have in the United States is not native. The one that we have is native to Europe, hence European honeybee. But there are other honeybees that are native to like Africa and Asia. And so depending on where you are in the world, you may be, there may be managed honeybees of other species, but also hybrid species. We've had the European honeybee in the United States since 1621. We know that they're highly social in ways that are unique to all the other, compared to the other native bees. And one of the other things that makes them unique is just their large colony size. So there's not going to be any native bees with colonies of this size. I'm going to talk about this more in future slides, but I tend to think of honeybees like chickens. They are domesticated animals that we use for very important tasks, but they are domesticated and imported. And then, of course, we do have feral honeybees out in ecosystems as well that are not managed. All right, so one of the reasons why the honeybee gets a lot of attention is because we have lots of documentation about their populations over time. And this figure right here is just showing the most recent trends in colony loss for honeybees. And there's a nonprofit organization called Bee Informed, and their website is beeinformed.org. And they're the main place where data on honeybee colonies is collected. And you can see that over time, there's variation in the number of honeybee colonies that are lost per year, with some years being worse than others, and some years, most of the loss being over winter versus total annual loss. Something I like to remind people when they're thinking about honeybee populations is like, there is a kind of a baseline, what we call acceptable loss. So, they are animals, and so you can't expect 100% survival year to year. And so there is kind of like a considered acceptable loss, and then there's work to try to mitigate any loss above that acceptable loss. But again, these are domesticated, and so I like to think of, leaving the concern about honeybees to the honeybee keepers. All right, so the thing though with the honeybees and their colonies is that there are struggles in maintaining high levels of honeybee colonies, but I like to think of the wild bees as like an insurance policy. So this picture right here is actually showing a lot of diversity of bees. There's a really great book called Bees in Your Backyard, where they have all these really amazing photographs of wild bees, and this is a kind of a clip from that. But you have insurance policies for all kinds of things, basically because you don't know what's going to happen in the future, right? And you want to be prepared for bad things to happen. And diversity in all animal groups, including the bees, can be considered an insurance policy, because if you have one particular species or group of bees that's struggling or goes extinct, there may be another bee that can fulfill that ecosystem service. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't be concerned when populations decline or something goes extinct, but if we can focus on maintaining diversity, we can perhaps have other animals to fill niches when some animals are lost. In particular, when we're considering wild bees versus managed bees like honeybees. And one of the reasons why the wild bees make for a good insurance policy is because they are so diverse. And this slide right here is good kind of like basic information about their body forms, but also their size. The wild bees come in large to tiny sizes. And this is important because not all flowers are the same, right? So we have a good diversity of flowering plants in both agriculture and wild habitats. And so as a consequence, you do really need a diversity of bee body forms and behaviors to serve as pollinators. The biggest ones in this particular figure are going to be things like bumblebees and carpenter bees. And then they range in size to very tiny to almost things that people don't notice. And some of those here, these green ones in particular, are called the sweat bees. And then the other really small ones, actually, there are some very small carpenter bees. So lots of folks know about the big carpenter bees, but some of these other really small black bees are really small carpenter bees. And we'll talk about different groups of the wild bees here in a minute. But I do have one video here. I didn't want to show too many videos just in case the internet connection wasn't great for everybody. But I wanted to highlight that it's not one size fit all for pollination services for a variety of reasons. Again, this is linked to plant and flower diversity, but the floral rewards or resources, so like pollen and nectar, are not all going to be accessible in the same way, depending on what kind of plant you are. But then also, like, bees have different preferences and behaviors. So different bees will go to flowers of different height. They'll forage at different times of day, different temperatures. And not all flowers are open all day, every day, or during different temperatures, or they don't grow at the same height. So this is why having diversity of bees is your best insurance for pollination. You also have different behaviors once the bees actually visit the flowers. And so that's what I have, like this within flower behavior. And one example of this is a pollination style called buzz pollination. And let me see if I need to get back to my clicker here to get the video to play. Is it going to play? Let's see. Oops. There it goes. Okay, so buzz pollination is what we call this particular behavior that's going to be shown in this video. And there shouldn't be sound because we really don't need it. But what this is going to show is actually a bumblebee on a flower where the pollen grains are not readily accessible, but instead, rather, they're inside these tubes that need to be vibrated in order for the pollen grains to be released. And so something like a bumblebee will actually do this vibration behavior once they visit the flower. And we call this buzz pollination. This right here is just the flower being like manually vibrated with something electronic. I'm not really sure. But you can see the pollen grains falling out as the flower is vibrated. And a lot of our fruits and vegetables need this behavior in order to be pollinated. So some of our squashes, things like cranberry and kiwis, have flowers of this type. And it's important to note that honeybees do not do this. So honeybees are not appropriate pollinators for all of our agricultural plants because they don't have this particular behavior. Okay, so that's buzz pollination. And so what we find is with large data sets, so, you know, in the realm of big data as we are today, we have these data sets that range the world. And this was a study published in Science in 2014. And this is a summary figure. The title of the paper here is Wild Pollinators Enhance Fruit Sets of Crops Regardless of Honeybee Abundance. And so what these researchers did was looked at crops of all types where there were honeybees only, which is represented by this blue line on the figure, where there were wild pollinators only. And so this particular line here, yellow, the little clip arts here actually are some bees, but also some flies. So this right here is a hoverfly. And then this pink line is showing honeybees in addition to the wild bees. And so you can kind of get a sense from this summary figure that, you know, across a diversity of crops, and it's going to be, you know, each crop is different, but the wild bees in general can offer better pollination services, leading to yield of our fruits and vegetables versus just honeybees. But when you have them in combination, you actually have the best yield. And so regardless of, you know, honeybee population status, I like to think about using honeybees potentially in the future as like a supplement to the wild bees as instead of a substitute. Because data like this shows that perhaps just in general, our crops would be better off with wild bees, regardless of the honeybee presence. Does anybody have any questions so far? I can take a second to pause. How's my speed? Am I talking too fast?
You're doing good, and there's no questions in the chat yet. So if you got a question, you can put it in the chat or just unmute yourself. And
okay. All right, so I'm going to move into talking about specific groups of native bees now, starting with our bumblebees, like we saw in the buzz pollination video. A fun fact about our bumblebees is these are going to be our only native social bees. So some other bees do kind of live in aggregate, so like they'll nest in close proximity to each other, but the bumblebees are the only other ones that have a true colony. There are some other social bees in Central and South America that I'm not really going to talk about. They're actually stingless bees, but the bumblebees, which can sting, are our only native social bees that you might find in Texas. And so here's a bumblebee. One of the common features between the bumblebees and like the honeybees and some others, any bee in the family Apidae, is that their main place to carry pollen is on their legs. And they have some very long hairs on their hind legs, which form like a basket. And so we call that the pollen basket. And so this is something that you'll see similar between foraging honeybees and bumblebees is the pollen loads on their legs. But essentially what a bumblebee life cycle is like, and I'm going to show some pictures of bees in addition to this graphic, but another difference between a honeybee colony and a bumblebee colony is that the bumblebees are functioning on a yearly cycle where honeybees have more of a continuously maintained colony over the years. You know, queens can be replaced over time, but the colony itself is maintained. But with the bumblebee, what happens is queens overwinter by themselves, so they hibernate. And in the spring, when it's warm enough, she will come out of hibernation, and she'll hibernate sometimes in ground cavities, but also sometimes in like low, maybe a cavity in wood if it's low, like close to the ground. But the queen will come out She had mated in the previous year, so I'll come back to that, but she's already been mated, so she has sperm. And so what she'll do is she'll lay an initial set of eggs, and she will take care of them herself. And she will raise the first set of worker bumblebees, and then once the bees she lays become adults, they kind of take over colony maintenance. And so during the summer, the colony will peak, and you could have several hundred bumblebees in a colony. And the queen is the only bee laying eggs, and then the rest of the colony is female, similar to honeybees. There will be some males, but they tend to leave the nest pretty quickly and just kind of live on their own, foraging, etc. But all the worker bees, similar to honeybees, will be the ones caring for new eggs and larvae and pupae in the colony. Then when it starts to get cooler in the fall, what will happen is the bumblebee queen will lay some eggs that will become new queens. And once the new queens start hatching, the old queen actually dies. Sometimes she'll die just naturally, but other times, like, the new queens literally attack her and kill her. Or sometimes the other workers will. The honeybee, sorry, I gotta get my bees right. The bumblebee queen can kind of control the reproductive status of the other females in the colony with like pheromones, but those pheromones tend to die off towards the end of the year, and so the worker bees can essentially mutiny against the queen, and then the old queen will die. The new queens will have left the nest, and they'll find a male to mate with, and then that's how she will get sperm to start the cycle for the next year. So she's able to hold sperm for her whole life cycle after a mating event the previous fall. So this is just kind of a general bumblebee life cycle, and just some pictures to see this kind of in action. This would be like a newly founded bumblebee nest, and so this would be a queen and her first set of well, this to me actually looks like her pupae cells. So often when bees go to the pupae form, the cells which the larvae and eggs were laid in get capped. And so she'll take care of them until they hatch. Bumblebees are typically ground nesters. And so they'll find old mammal nests, like mouse nests, to start their colonies in. But so typically they'll be on the ground. Over time, a bumblebee colony might look something like this. Lots of cells. The bumblebees can make a wax similar to honeybees. However, they are not using any of their cells to store and make honey like honeybees. Since bumblebees don't overwinter as an active colony, they don't need honey stores. But they will store pollen sometimes to go through lean times during the spring and summer. But you're not going to find honey stores in a bumblebee colony. They do spend 6 to 8 months of the year focused on foraging. Okay, so most of the workers may be out foraging, or they may be back in the colony taking care of the queen and the other larvae. But you'll see bumblebees quite frequently looking for nectar, but also pollen. So we're on a yearly life cycle rather than a continuous life cycle like the honeybees. There are some bumblebees that are managed for commercial purposes. And so if you own some sort of greenhouse with vegetables, you may actually use bumblebees. Honeybees can also be used in greenhouses, but again, when you're trying to grow things like vegetables, bumblebees are actually better pollinators. And so there are actually some commercially managed bumblebee colonies as well. There's at least 9 species of bumblebees in Texas. And, bumblebees are one of my favorites to observe because they can be a bit easier to identify as species than a lot of our other bees, just because you can look at their patterning of their black and white stripes to get a good idea about what species it is. In regards to what's most abundant locally, just from what I've observed, from my students collecting bees for our insect collections and also some bee surveys we've done, it seems to me like locally the American honeybee is probably the most prevalent, but there are some others that we might find here in North Texas. And probably the best thing to do is to make observations of bees, because we do have data suggesting that not only wild bees in general populations are declining, but in particular bumblebee populations. And so there is a paper published several years ago now about the decline in North American bumblebees. And I have a little bit of data to show you from this article. But essentially what you can do is look at insect collections and try to get understanding of how bee populations would have changed pretty much over the last 100 years. And so this data set's pretty neat because it's used insect and museum collections starting from the 1900s to more current times to try to understand perhaps what it was the relative abundance of certain bumblebee species then and now. And this particular data set, in the black bars, you have the historical data, and the gray bars is the current observation at the time of this paper was published. And so the data is a little bit older now, but you can see the trend whereby some species do seem to be more abundant now than they were in the past, but then others are definitely less abundant now than they were in the past. And so each of these sets of bars is a different species. This bee, the bee is short for bombus, which is the species genus for bumblebees. So all bumblebees are bombus. And then there's different species here. They focused on 8 species in this particular paper. Anyways, in this particular paper, Texas was looped into the global east for what it's worth. And of the 3 species that they had observations for, one that seems to be in decline today versus historical patterns is that American honeybee that I pointed out before. And so here's different trends though across the United States. I'm going to talk more in my talk, a few more slides in the future here about what we can do about this. But essentially something that you can do like any day is share your observations. So again, because bumblebees are large insects, it's a little bit easier to identify them to species using just your eyes or photographs. And so using a citizen science source like iNaturalist is useful for keeping track of bumblebee populations, even if you're not collecting them. How many here uses iNaturalist? Yeah, quite a few. If you're not familiar with iNaturalist, I highly recommend it. The app and the website just keep getting better and better over time, and they can actually use basically imaging analysis to help you identify what you're taking pictures of. And so again, I definitely recommend taking pictures of bumblebees and posting them on iNaturalist, because researchers around the world essentially use this as a database. And so you can contribute to really important conservation research by using iNaturalist. Anyways, take pictures of bumblebees, and so we can keep better track of them now and in the future. So hopefully there'll be an updated kind of review paper about the populations of bumblebees, but something like iNaturalist is definitely going to help with that. Okay, so one thing though to keep in mind, and iNaturalist can help you with this, is that there's lots of bumblebee kind of lookalikes. Okay, and so I'm gonna ask if someone wants to answer, which are both of these in this picture a bumblebee, or is only one a bumblebee? It's our first
only
quiz.
one.
Only one, David. So which one is the bumblebee, on the left or the right?
The one on the left, the other one doesn't have a hairy abdomen.
Excellent. Excellent. So when you're looking out for honey or for bumblebees, something to consider is there may be some bumblebees out there with fully black abdomens, but there are other bees out there. This particular is a carpenter bee, doesn't have as much hair on the abdomen, and they tend to be bigger carpenter bees, at least this kind. And so yes, so on the left here is a bumblebee, and on the right is actually a carpenter bee. And we can tell because there's less hair on the abdomen. Awesome. Okay, so you guys passed my first quiz. What about these guys? Bumblebees, yes or no?
The one on the right definitely isn't. I don't know about the other one.
Do you know which type of insect the one on the right is, David?
No.
That's all right. So these right here are actually flies. We call these robber flies. Both of these pictures are flies. And it can be a little bit hard to tell if you don't have practice looking at robber flies, especially the bee mimicking robber flies, because it's hairy. The whole body is hairy. But at least on the picture on the left, one thing that you can see is this little kind of nub here behind the pair of wings. Flies only have one set of true wings, and their hind wings are very reduced into a structure called a haltere. And so if you can see halteres, this little nub, then we definitely know we have a fly. Something else to look out for is actually the mouth parts. So you can see it again better on the picture on the left and the picture on the right. But the robber flies are going to have kind of like a piercing mouth part, similar to like a horsefly. Whereas bees have mandibles that are, for chewing, basically. They use it more for manipulating pollen than they do like eating things like a wasp. But we see more of a beak-like mouth part. It's going to be a robber fly rather than a bumblebee. Also, just in general, as an entomologist, one of the things I look for is like the head shape. Bees' heads tend to be more of a heart, and then fly heads tend to be more round or like an oval. And so that's something else I look out for. But again, something like iNaturalist can definitely help because the imaging software basically gives you hints as to what you're looking at. And the body form here is also a little bit different. You'll notice it's a little bit more elongated versus like globular or round. And so that's something else to look out for. But so these are not bumblebees, rather these are robber flies. So they're predatory flies. When it comes to mimicry, the idea here is like, even though the robber flies don't have stingers, what they do is they're mimicking the advertisement of stinging insects in order to avoid their own predators, or at least that's the thought of how this would have come to be over evolutionary time. So anyways, look out for these. They're not really harmful to people. They avoid people. They're really fast flyers. And so if you try to catch one, it's going to be actually fairly difficult. But they're predatory. Often actually I see robber flies eating wasps for what it's worth. So if you want to have less wasps for whatever reason, let the robber flies help you take care of them. All right, what about this one?
Moth.
All right, so what about it tells you this is a moth?
Well, I just happen to know that those moths with the clear wing moths or Prometheus moths or whatever, they're fairly common around here, so we see them all the time.
Yes. So this is what we call a clear wing moth. Again, somewhat of a bee mimic. And something to look out for is that one, the antennae are not clubbed. or I'm sorry, they're not elbowed. And so one of the key features of bees, wasps, and ants that can help you distinguish them from other insects is that their antennae are going to be elbow shaped, which means they're going to have an angle to them. And so I'm going to go back a few slides actually to kind of point that out. But you'll notice actually the robber flies don't have elbowed antennae either. The elbow sometimes is not like super distinct, but you do notice a slight bend here in this bumblebee and the carpenter bee. But yeah, so Hymenoptera just in general tend to have elbow antennae. And then the other thing to look out for is actually the waist. So if you have a bee, wasp, or an ant, the space between the thorax, or where the wings and legs are attached, and the abdomen is going to be very constricted. And so if you have an insect with the body form with no waist, then it's probably not a Hymenoptera or a bee, wasp, or ant. And so I'm going to go back again to our bumblebee and carpenter bee, but you'll notice there is a very strong constriction between the thorax and the abdomen. Okay, so that's going to be another clue as to whether or not you have a bee or Hymenoptera or something else that might be mimicking a bee. All right, so yes, this is going to be a moth. And I think someone indicated the species here, but yeah, we call this a snowberry clearwing. These are pretty fun to get for insect collections. I see them every now and then. Okay, so moving on from bumblebees, which are our only local native social bee, we have thousands of species of solitary bees. So just in general, there's about 20,000 species of bees around the world, and probably about 90% of them are solitary. In regards to Texas bees, we have about 800 species. And again, the only native ones that are going to be social are the 8 or 9 bumblebee species. And so the vast majority are going to be solitary. And this right here is just kind of a general solitary bee life cycle. Again, it's going to vary depending on what species we're talking about. But similar to bumblebees, again, their life cycle is on a yearly basis rather than across years like honeybees. But we have dormant adults, in particular females and males, but they'll hatch in the spring, or they're not, I shouldn't say hatch because they're not coming out of egg, but they'll come out of dormancy. They'll emerge in the spring. They'll collect pollen resources and nectar to not only feed themselves, but to facilitate their eggs developing into larvae, into pupae. And they can do that all spring and summer. They may do 1 or 2 generations, depending on the bee. But then come fall, you'll have another set of dormant adults. And so this is kind of a generalized solitary bee life cycle. Okay, I think I need to move a little bit faster so we can not be here like for 2 hours, but we're gonna keep on keeping on. Here's another really great Alex Wild picture. This right here is a carpenter bee. It's got a shiny black abdomen with not too many hairs. Something else that's kind of neat about Hymenopteran that I'll point out from this picture is you'll notice it kind of looks like this bee only has one large wing on the left and the right side. But really what's happening here is you have a front wing and a hind wing and they're hooked together. So at the front margin of the hind wing, there's actually these little hooks. And it's kind of like Velcro, but the hind wing and the front wing hooked together. And so they fly with their front wings and their hind wings kind of as one. But sometimes when you're collecting them, you can actually see them unhooked. And sometimes for my insect collections, you can hook them back together with these little tiny hooks. So that's something that's kind of unique for the bees, wasps, and ants. A pretty good proportion of our solitary bees are essentially cavity nesters, particularly using wood or plant resources. And there's a variety of places where these wood nesters or cavity nesters might utilize. But something to keep in mind is that the solitary bees are typically not defending their nest sites. And so that's why solitary bees tend to be less aggressive than the social bees, because they're not defending them. Essentially, they make their nest and then they move on. Like they don't stick around to take care of them. And so anyways, I'm going to talk about some of these wood nesting bees. Here's a good example of a bee going into a stem. And so sometimes our like woody or forb plants, when they kind of get dry in the fall, the internal portions of the stems kind of get hollowed out, and the bees can use that as a nest. Carpenter bees, however, honestly, most people who talk to me about carpenter bees are asking me how to get rid of them. And I don't have a very good answer to that question because I don't really study a lot how to kill insects. Mostly I just learn how to have more of them. So I don't have a particularly good answer if you're going to ask me that, but I can try. I found this really cool recent study about carpenter bees where they actually use a CT scanner to look at logs where carpenter bees are nesting over time. And something kind of interesting that they found was, the same logs can get used over and over if it's left out long enough. And eventually the log can basically be almost entirely carpenter bee cavities, like more cavity than actual log. And in this particular picture here on the bottom left, what it's showing is in the color are like independent nesting sites of carpenter bees where they've tunneled. And then in the blue is kind of like where all the tunnels end up being connected. And so this particular log has lots of old and new carpenter bee nests. The nesting itself, they can be deep or they can be somewhat shallow. Here on the right, the little yellow dot indicates the entrance, and then you can see kind of the different shapes of the nests that are formed. But what a carpenter bee will do is excavate the dead wood in order to make these cavities. And they'll lay their egg in the cavity, but also leave a ball of pollen and nectar for the larvae to eat. And eventually will pupate and emerge as an adult carpenter bee. But once the egg is laid with the little food ball in the cavity, the mom bee doesn't spend any more time on parental care. And so this is why we call them solitary. Here's a really good picture from Alex Wild of the smaller carpenter bees. They can be like 1 millimeter to a couple millimeters versus like an inch or two. But the small carpenter bees tend to be black. That's just an observation. You can see the slight elbow in the antennae. You can see sort of covered by the leg, but there's going to be a constriction in the waist. And then if we had a high power microscope, you would see that these hairs are branched. Some of our other cavity nesters are called leaf cutters or mason bees. These are going to be different than things like the carpenter bees and bumblebees and honeybees because instead of having their legs as the main pollen collecting location, they actually use long hairs underneath their abdomen. And so if you ever see a bee that's foraging and it seems like the pollen is on the abdomen versus on the legs, then you're going to have a leaf cutter or a mason bee. This is in the family called Megachalidae. They're both in there. And so what these bees do to make their cavities, in particular, the leaf cutters are one of my favorite, but similar to like a leaf cutting ant, they'll collect pieces of leaves. And there are plant types that they prefer to collect leaves from, but they'll carry their leaf pieces to a cavity that's already made. So unlike the carpenter bees, leaf cutters and mason bees don't tend to make their own cavities, but they'll use cavities that already exist. And in the case of the leaf cutters, they'll make these cells for their eggs and they'll seal them with leaf material. They can kind of use their saliva as like a glue. And so they'll make these little compartments for a bee. And so each one of these here would probably have one egg and one food ball or like the little pollen packet. And this picture right here on the bottom right is going to be some leafcutter bees utilizing some bamboo stems that someone has put out. But here's some leafcutter bees. here's kind of a cross section of what a leafcutter bee nest might look like. And here's a picture of a leafcutter bee actually collecting leaf material. And so if you see this kind of damage on some of your plants in your garden, be aware it may not be things like caterpillars, which you may not want eating certain plants, depending on what it is, but it may instead be leafcutter bees. There is one leafcutter bee that's used in agriculture that I know of. This is the alfalfa bee. It's a leafcutter. You can see it's got long hairs on the bottom of its abdomen, so that's where it's going to collect pollen. In this particular picture, this alfalfa bee is on a milkweed, but because alfalfa is not a native plant, it's actually from Asia. People do import the alfalfa leafcutter bee to pollinate alfalfa fields, just because they have coexisted for a long time. They're really good pollinators. And so what you'll see sometimes in alfalfa fields are basically giant bee hotels where the farmers have offered cavities to the leaf cutting alfalfa bees to make their nest in order to support their populations to produce alfalfa. So these are non-native, however, keep in mind, non-native, for better or for worse. Here's some mason bees. Really, the difference here between the leaf cutters and the mason bees is that mason bees are using mud rather than leaf material to make their little cavities. And you can actually see pretty young larvae in this picture and with the pollen ball. And so this larvae will eat the pollen ball, eventually pupate and come out as an adult bee. So these are mud users, the mason bees. Oops. My main kind of take-home message, if you want to support the cavity nesters, is to leave wooded areas intact. If you have debris like fallen branches, for example, on your property, instead of cleaning them or getting rid of them, leave them out. I tend to just have an area in my yard where I pile things. And so instead of getting rid of them, I leave them. And if you ever see wood that looks like this, it's going to be used by bees. For bees that might use flowering stems as nesting sites, this is just some general information on how you can support them. But essentially, the take-home message here is to not cut back your perennials to the ground, because if you cut them, the bees can use the stems as they hollow out as nesting sites. But you don't want to get rid of the dead stems because there's actually could be bees in there. Okay. So my advice would be to not cut your perennials down to the ground. Instead, just leave the old stems where they are. Deadheading is fine in regards to promoting flowering, but leave the stems because some of our bees may be using them. Okay, who has a bee hotel on their property? Anybody? No bee hotels out there?
I've got one.
All right. So I'm going to talk a few minutes about bee hotels, and just as a caveat, I don't really have a strong opinion one way or the other, but there are some things to know about bee hotels that may influence your decision whether or not to use them. And so just in general, if you haven't heard of a bee hotel, my picture is kind of blurry here, but essentially a bee hotel is any sort of nesting site provided by a person. And typically it'll consist of wood where someone has drilled holes in, or perhaps it's a bundle of hollow stems like bamboo. But bee hotels recently have been getting lots of attention for use in promoting wild bee diversity. But there's some things to think about. And one of the things is like, there's no doorkeeper. Okay. So you could have different species of invertebrates using your bee hotel, whether you want them to or not. Some spiders might use it, or wasps. There are lots of solitary wasps that also are cavity nesters. And so depending on your goals, you may or may not want to have a bee hotel hosting other types of invertebrates. And so it helps to kind of keep an eye on your hotels. One of the kind of negative things about bee hotels is because you may have bees aggregating in a very small space, is that they may be highly accessible to predators and also parasitoids. So in this picture, we show everybody's friend, the fire ants. So like if fire ants can get access to your bee hotel, they would love to eat the bee larvae. In the middle picture here is actually a parasitoid wasp. And so what you're seeing here is a wasp with a really long ovipositor. When you have a bunch of bee nests put together in a small space, basically you're giving something like this parasitoid wasp easy prey, easy and lots of prey and all in one spot. So she will use this really long ovipositor to reach into the cells where the bee larvae are to lay her egg, and then the wasp larvae will eat the bee larvae, and then you're not actually having bees. Okay. And so something to keep an eye out for is one, ants, but also parasitoid wasps. There is some data about whether or not bee hotels support wild bee populations. And so this was a paper published in 2015 about bee hotels, and they kind of quantified who was using the hotels in regards to introduced bees versus native bees, introduced wasps versus native wasps, and then kind of in aggregate. And you'll notice that, at least from this data set, most of the bee hotel were utilized by non-native bees. Okay. And then this was not just the number of like cavities, but they actually looked at the number of brood cells in regards to brood is going to be larvae and eggs. So which larvae and eggs were present. Most of the bee hotels in this particular study were used by non-native bees. So it's kind of not really well understood what's going to be the long-term impact of using bee hotels, although bee hotels are used, for example, in alfalfa agriculture to support the leafcutter bee. Okay, and then the other thing to keep in mind is actually the vast majority of our native bees are ground nesters, not cavity nesters. And so really the resource that needs attention in addition to cavities is going to be just ground. And so we have lots of ground nesting bees, and they'll do similar to the cavity nesting bees, but they'll excavate essentially cells where they'll put little pollen packets for their larvae to develop. And these bees can be found in aggregate sometimes. And so you might see a patch of ground that looks like this. This is going to be solitary bees and or wasps. One of the kind of nice bees that it was one of my favorites that can use cavities or ground nesting sites is our green sweat bee. These particular bees do use their legs mostly for their pollen collection, but these tend to be very small but metallic bees, and it's a pretty large group. So in regards to diversity, the biggest diversity is in the Apidae, which is the family that includes the honeybees, bumblebees, and carpenter bees. And then the second largest group is going to be the group that contains these sweat bees. In order to support the ground nesting bees, some things to do is to avoid tilling, avoid excessive erosion or compaction. In particular, if you have farm animals, even if there's exposed ground, the problem is like if you have a bunch of cows or goats or something like walking all over, then the ground can become too compacted for the bees to use. Tilling is getting more attention in agriculture because we do know that if you till the soil, you could potentially be disrupting the ground nesters, but also heavy mulch. So there's pros and cons to using mulch in gardening, but the problem is if you use really thick mulch, the ground nesting bees won't be able to access the soil surface. And so you won't get ground nesting bees, which is most of our native bees. This is a picture I did take. So this is probably like the one picture I did take in this whole presentation, but I was at home on the East Coast in Baltimore, and I was at a local park, and they actually had an area designated for the ground nesting bees. And so I would say if you ever do come across the ground nesting bees, just do your best not to disturb them, especially when they're active. Try not to mow too much, and definitely don't cover the bare patches. It's not the most aesthetic, which is why people tend to not let their lawns look like this, but sometimes we got to reframe our mind in regards to our goals. Like if you want to support native bees, we need bare ground patches. Okay, so I'm going to talk probably about, I'm probably going to try to leave this to like 10 or 15 more minutes, but just in general, bee populations are getting lots of attention, probably honeybees more than others. And so I want to talk a little bit more about what might be affecting our wild bees. I did talk about bumblebees a little bit, but just in general, the data on wild pollinators suggests that they're declining. And there's a couple of things that might be contributing to that. Let's see. This is a slide, right? Or this is, so this is a summary figure from another paper from Science, but there's kind of a collection of things that are impacting both managed and unmanaged bees. And part of the story is going to be lack of floral resources or diverse floral resources. So similar to us, if we only ate one food item, we would be unhealthy, right? Because you're not getting a diversity of nutrients. And the same for bees. And so agricultural fields tend to not be the healthiest place for bees because you have large swaths of land with the same type of plant, monocultures. And so honeybees and other bees may not be as healthy as they could be if they had a diversity of plant to feed on. There's also a variety of parasites and pathogens that impact bees. And then there's other chemicals in our environment that may be negatively impacting the wild bees. In particular, any sort of pesticide like pyrethroids are a really common used pesticide. Can definitely negatively impact our native bees. Anytime mosquito spraying is done, yes, mosquitoes are the target, but those insecticides are typically broad spectrum, meaning they impact pretty much any insect, not just the mosquitoes. Something new that's being found, especially from agriculture, is that fungicides can negatively impact bees. And so, especially in almond plantations, you use lots of fungicides to keep fungus from growing on the fruits or from growing on the fruits. And they can be toxic to bees. And then there is a widely used insecticide called neonicotinoids, which essentially is a synthetic nicotine. This in particular can be of concern because neonicotinoids are often not sprayed, but they're seed coated. And so depending on where you're getting plants, even for your own garden, you may be getting neonicotinoid treated plants. And so the plant will have the pesticide for most of its growing season because the insecticide is on the seeds and then the plant is absorbing it as it grows. So all of these things impact not only honeybees, but the wild bees as well. And there may be some negative impacts of using managed bees on our native bees. And this is kind of a title that I liked because it's really direct. And it just says like conserving honeybees does not help wildlife. And in particular, this is another Science article, but in particular, this article was arguing that managed honeybees can harm wild pollinators for several reasons. And I got my little chicken here as my analogy for the honeybees. But similar to, we have lots of concerns about human public health right now, but there's also lots of increased concerns on the public health of our native bees. And there's kind of two questions on the table. And what these questions are do the non-native bees like honeybees outcompete native bees for flower resources? And then the other question is going to be, do the commercially used bees lead to increased pathogens in native bees? or is there, you might call it spillover. So again, the thing about honeybees that's different from our other bees is the colony sizes are so big, and they have, thousands and thousands of foragers. And so if you have honeybees in an area where they're not native, they may be out competing the wild bees for floral resources just due to their abundance. In addition, when you have commercial bees or commercially managed bees, you have a lot of bees in a small space. And similar to people, when you have lots of living things in a small space, pathogens and diseases can get spread fairly easy. And it seems like when you have commercially used bees foraging on flowers that wild bees also visit, there could be spillover, or the commercial bees transmit the disease to the wild bees via the flowers. And this can be diseases like any sort of parasite like mites, but also viruses like deformed wing virus. And so these two questions are probably the biggest questions right now in regards to wild pollinator conservation. So not only do we need to understand like the current status of their diversity and abundance, but we need to understand how our managed honeybees may be impacting the wild bees. And essentially, there's not a whole lot of data on this because it's kind of a new area to consider. But I have a summary slide here from a review paper, pretty much the most recent review paper I could find. But essentially, it doesn't matter if the managed bee is native or non-native. But in regards to competition for floral resources, it seems like the managed bees have either neutral or negative effects on wild bees. And then in regards to transmission of pathogens, it's kind of the same trend. Where you have high pathogen loads in managed bees, you have more pathogens in wild bees. And similar to how we track things like COVID, the way that we're going to really understand this is with genetics. And so if you sample the wild bees and look at their pathogens, you can use genetic relatedness to connect the pathogens that you're observing in the wild bees to pathogens in local commercial bees. And so this is, again, kind of a growing area, and the thing to keep an eye out is how can we better understand how do the managed bees compete with wild bees, but also what's the deal with disease transmission. Some caveat here on the transmission data that's really well articulated in this particular article is that most of the data right now is focused on transmission, but there's not a lot of data on how at the end of the day does that impact populations or just survival of the wild bees. And so really at the end of the day, we, like any other scientific endeavor, we just need more data. So this is my last slide, so I'm going to stop here, but I just want to leave everyone with a to-do list. Your first thing to do is just take the time to observe native bees around you. And the more you observe, the better you'll get at identifying them, but also document them. So like using iNaturalist is going to be a really great help to researchers focused on bees. And then not only at your home, but in other areas where you might have influence, be sure to promote the maintenance, but also the improvement of habitat. Okay, so if you have wild, if you have native perennial plants, grow more of them. If you have woody material on your property, leave it there. Try to leave some ground uncovered, especially if you notice there's ground nesting bees, just leave them, don't mulch over them, and stuff like that. So this is kind of a to-do list for everybody. My dogs are playing in the background, so I apologize if you start hearing some barking. But I would be happy to field any and all questions that you guys have about bees or insects or anything you got for me.
If anybody has questions, they can unmute themselves and feel free to ask, or you can type it in the chat.
This is David Turner. I have a question.
Sure.
On the leafcutter bees, are there specific native plants that the beef cutter, beef leaf cutter bees prefer?
There are, but to be honest, I don't have a running list in my head. But what I can do is get you a list and have maybe Alan kind of disperse it to the attendees today. But yes, there definitely are some leaves that they prefer over others.
Well, we try to plant stuff in the Hagerman butterfly garden for not only for pollen, but also for host plants. And we try to leave our goldenrods and things, for bees to overwinter in. But anything that could help support those, we'd be interested in knowing and being able to plant them there.
Yeah, I'll try to find a list of local native plants that the leafcutter bees would like.
David, our Turk's cap, they like that a lot.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. I have some Turk's cap at my house and I've noticed. So yeah, Turk's cap would be one of those for sure.
Certainly something is taking chunks out of the Turk's cap, both at Hagerman and at my house. So leafcutter bees. Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of like, again, you gotta, somewhere like at Hagerman and stuff, like, it just depends on what your goals are. Like, I'm hoping the trend will be that people aren't so trigger happy when it comes to like seeing damage on their plants, like just letting nature run its course. I mean, sometimes I have plants that like caterpillars like completely decimate that I don't want them to. And so usually what I do though is instead of spraying insecticide, I'll manually remove caterpillars. But it depends on your goals. So varroa mites, Karen's asking in the chat about varroa mites. Varroa mites are mainly a problem for colony bees. However, one of the diseases that the varroa mite vectors is the deformed wing virus. Deformed wing virus can impact non-social bees, regardless of the presence or absence of the mite. So the mite does kind of move the disease amongst honeybees pretty rapidly, but the disease can infect solitary bees as well.
We've got another question that Pat put in the chat asking about the Sneed Prairie, which is managed by Austin College, wanting to know if it's open to the public and available for hiking or observing there at the Sneed Prairie.
Sure. So in general, it's not open to the public, but if there's interest, what I can do is get you in contact with the director of the environmental studies program that we have who manages the prairie. And maybe what we can do is kind of have like set days where, like a Saturday or something that, it's open for public on that particular day. But any given day, it is closed to the public. Yeah.
Remind me who the gentleman is that manages the prairie there.
Yeah, it's Dr. Pete Schultz.
And he's spoken to this group before on some of the restoration work he's been doing there.
Yeah, the prairie site is really beautiful right now. I was there earlier this week. We got lots of gay feather and thistles and lots of plants that our pollinators like. So it's a good site. Awesome. Okay. So actually there was one more thing I wanted to share in regards to if you ever want, and let me actually stop my share here. And I probably need to get rid of my virtual background so I can show you guys something. If you're ever looking for somewhere to learn more about bees, who has this magazine? Anybody? It's called 2 Million Blossoms. There it is. This is like a new publication. It's really amazing. As far as I know, it's only been out for like a year. But the pictures and the information they have about pollinators is really great. And it does focus on diversity of pollinators. So it's not all about bees. But I've learned new things from reading this than, that I haven't known before. In fact, this is where I learned about the the study of the carpenter bees using the CT scan of the logs. And so if you like magazines, I really recommend this. It's really nice. It's called 2 Million Blossoms is the magazine.
You must be a great question and great presenter because you answered all everybody's questions during your talk. So.
That, or I was so confusing that you can't even think of a question.
No.
Alan was right.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thanks everyone. We had up to 30 people join today, which is a new record for our second Saturday programs. Appreciate everybody attending. We've got some nice complimentary remarks in the chat. So pay attention to those, Lorraine.
Well, I appreciate the kind words. And again, like the bees is really not my bread and butter. And so if someone wants to know more, I can definitely point you in the direction of a few Texas folks who know more than I do. In particular, there's a lab at UT Austin that focuses on native bees. And I forget what her first name is, but her last name is Jew. So Dr. Jew at UT Austin is kind of one of the main researchers right now. And so some of my information is sourced from her website. But yeah, I'm constantly learning more about the wild bees myself, just since I've taken the past few years to kind of revamp my garden. One of the plants that I've noticed that I think it's the small carpenter bees really like is the oxeye daisy, the little white and yellow flowers. Mine are always covered in solitary bees, which is kind of nice.
Cool. Well, thanks again, Lorraine, and enjoyed the program for sure. I learned a few things myself, so it's always good to get a new perspective on our native flora and fauna.
Yep.
If nobody has any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the meeting here. I have been recording this. I hope that's okay, Loriann. We may be able to share that.
That's quite all right.
Share it on the Friends of Hagerman website. Make it available for people that may have missed the meeting here. So we'll get that posted in the next several days with some help from Patricia and others. So if there's no last minute questions, I'm going to go ahead and close down the meeting, and appreciate everybody joining today. It was a great session.
Yeah, it was. Thanks, Alan.
Thanks, Alan, for hosting us.